It was a typical morning at Oakwood High School, a suburban public school nestled on the edge of a quiet town in Pennsylvania. The usual bustle of students flooded the hallways, the sound of lockers slamming and groups chatting as they made their way to class. But beneath the surface of the daily routine, something darker simmered. Maya Johnson, a 17-year-old senior, was used to the way things worked around here. She'd grown up in this town, went through elementary school and middle school with the same kids who were now her classmates in high school. But as she sat in the cafeteria, listening to the laughter of her peers, she couldn't ignore the whispers that surrounded her. Did you hear what they said to her yesterday? It's disgusting. I mean, she doesn't even deserve to be on the team. Just look at her. The comments were always made quietly, under the guise of casual conversation, but they were loud enough for Maya to hear. They were directed at her friend, Jamal Williams, a tall, athletic black student who had been a standout player on the school's basketball team since his freshman year. Jamal had always been easygoing, laughing off the occasional snide comment or casual racial remark. It was almost as if everyone had accepted the unspoken rule that as long as he didn't fight back, the ignorance would stay under the surface. Maya had never been one to sit back and let things slide. But over the years, she'd noticed that most of the teachers, no, all of the teachers, turned a blind eye to the quiet racism. It wasn't the loud, overt kind. It was the small slights, the dismissive comments, the way people would ignore Jamal during group work or mock his hair and his skin tone when he wasn't around. But Maya saw it, and it bothered her. The thing that bothered her most was that no one else seemed to care. Jamal had been quiet about it, unwilling to stir the pot, even though Maya could see the hurt behind his smile. She had tried to bring it up with teachers before, but it was always brushed off with vague statements like, "Oh, they're just kids. They don't understand what they're saying," or "You're being too sensitive." That morning, as Maya sat at her usual spot in the cafeteria, she watched as a group of students, mostly white, laughed at something Jamal had said. One of them, Sarah Green, the girl who'd been sitting near Jamal since elementary school, threw a sneer in his direction when he turned away. The others joined in, muttering something about Jamal's swagger and how it was annoying. Maya's jaw clenched. She had to do something. But what could she do? She was just one person, and the school was a maze of cliques divided by unspoken boundaries. Boundaries that had existed for as long as she could remember. The majority of the student body was white, but there were a handful of black, Hispanic, and Asian students who, like Jamal, had long learned to blend in and keep their heads down. The system was set up to silence them. As the bell rang, signaling the start of first period, Maya stood up, grabbing her bag. Jamal had already walked ahead, his shoulders slightly slumped as he made his way down the hallway. Maya caught up with him, walking beside him as they made their way to history class. "You good?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jamal glanced at her, offering a half smile. "Yeah, just the usual." Maya frowned. "You know, they've been at it again. I heard them today." He sighed. "Maya, it's nothing. Just ignore it." "That's what I mean," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Why do you have to ignore it? Why does everyone keep acting like it's no big deal?" Jamal stopped walking and looked at her. His eyes, dark and tired, met hers. "Because I've got bigger things to worry about, Maya. You know how it is. No one's going to care." Maya shook her head. "That's not true. Someone has to care." The next few days passed like any other, but the tension was palpable. It seemed as though the school's atmosphere had thickened, weighted by the unspoken. In the hallways, in the cafeteria, even in the classrooms, People walked around with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, pretending that the issues at hand weren't as big as they truly were. But Maya couldn't ignore it anymore. Jamal's silence had become her burden too. The problem was bigger than just Jamal, though. It was the entire school. Years of subtle racism, years of whispers and quiet judgments, all woven into the fabric of Oakwood High. It was the way the teachers overlooked small slights, the way the students turned a blind eye to the hurtful jokes that circulated in the locker rooms, or the casual racism that tainted the lunchroom. Maya had been debating whether she should speak out for weeks, but she had always held back, unsure of how to confront it without risking her own reputation. She wasn't black. She didn't face the same microaggressions that Jamal did on a daily basis. So what right did she have to make noise? It was a dilemma that gnawed at her, pulling her in two directions. But one conversation in the school library with her best friend, Kira, changed everything. Kira was the kind of person who always spoke her mind, no matter the consequences. The two girls had known each other since elementary school, and Maya had always admired Kira's unwavering courage. Kira didn't fear the judgment of others. She took it head on, and that confidence had always been a source of inspiration for Maya. Maya, you can't just keep letting this slide, Kira said one afternoon, as they sat at a table in the quiet library. You've seen the way they treat Jamal. It's not okay. It's not just harmless teasing, you know? Maya sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing on her chest. I know, Kira, but I don't know what to do. I've talked to the teachers before. Nothing ever happens. They all just say, it's not a big deal, or you're overreacting, but it is a big deal. Kira leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing as she spoke. Then maybe we need to make it a bigger deal. We need to take it to the next level. If no one else is going to say anything, we will. You've got the power to do this, Maya. You've got the voice. Maya stared at her, considering Kira's words. She had always admired her friend's strength, but now, more than ever, Maya felt a pull. A part of her, the part that had been silenced for so long, wanted to speak out, to make the silence break. I don't know, she hesitated. What if it makes things worse? What if they just turn it around on me? Kira chuckled, a low, confident sound. Then it's their problem, not yours. Maya, think about it. You can either sit back and watch this continue, or you can do something. Don't let fear control you. Maya looked down at the table, the words echoing in her mind. Fear. She had been living with it for so long. The fear of rejection, of being singled out. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it was precisely that fear that had kept the system intact. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered what would happen if she stood up to it. Over the next few days, Maya made her decision. She couldn't stay silent anymore. It was time to speak up. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. It was during gym class when Maya saw her chance. Jamal had just finished a game of basketball, his usual spot on the court at the center of the action. Maya could see the familiar, easy smile on his face as he joked with his teammates. But she could also see the discomfort in his eyes, the way his guard was up, as if bracing for something. It was subtle, but Maya noticed it. She had seen it too many times before. The coach, Mr. Harris, was chatting with a few of the students by the bleachers when Sarah Green and her friends walked up, clearly amused. Sarah was the type of girl who never seemed to have a care in the world, her blonde hair shining in the fluorescent gym lights. But Maya could see the sneer on her face as she leaned in to whisper something to her friend, Emily, a girl who was always eager to go along with whatever Sarah said. Can you believe Jamal actually thinks he's good enough to be on the varsity team? Sarah muttered loud enough for Maya to hear. I mean, he's fast. I'll give him that. But he's got nothing on the real players. Emily giggled, and Sarah's group joined in, chuckling at their own joke. Maya could see Jamal, still catching his breath from the game, trying to ignore the conversation. But she knew better. She knew what he was feeling. Her heart began to pound in her chest. Maya couldn't stay silent anymore. "Hey," Maya called out, her voice steady but loud enough to draw attention. "You think that's funny, Sarah?" The group fell silent, their eyes turning toward her. Sarah's confident grin faltered as she glanced at Maya. "What? You think it's funny to mock someone just because they're good at something?" Maya continued, taking a step towards Sarah. "Jamal's been on the team since freshman year. He's earned his spot. So maybe it's time you stop acting like he's some kind of joke." For a moment, the gym was silent, and Maya felt the eyes of everyone on her. She could see Jamal out of the corner of her eye, frozen in place, watching her. "Why don't you mind your own business, Maya?" Sarah sneered, the smugness returning to her face. "It's just a little fun. Don't act like you don't joke around with us." "This isn't fun," Maya said, her voice rising. "This is racism. This is disrespect." There was a pause, and then Sarah's group burst into laughter, as if Maya's words were nothing but a joke to them. Emily rolled her eyes, and the other girls started to walk away, dismissing Maya. But Maya wasn't done. She turned to face Jamal, who was still standing there, his posture stiff. "I'm sorry," she said softly, so only he could hear. "I had to say something." Jamal shook his head, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to, Maya. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be," she replied firmly. And at that moment, she realized that she had just ignited something. The next day, the entire school was buzzing with whispers. It didn't take long for Maya's confrontation with Sarah and her friends to spread like wildfire through Oakwood High. Some students supported her, while others, like Sarah's group, dismissed the entire situation as overblown. Still, no one could deny that things had changed. Jamal, however, kept his distance. He wasn't angry with Maya, but the last thing he wanted was to attract more attention to himself. He had spent years learning to brush off the subtle racism, and now, Maya's confrontation had made him the center of a storm. Maya had hoped that standing up would spark a change, but she didn't realize how deep the issue ran. As the days passed, the school seemed to divide itself further. Some of the white students, mostly those who had always kept quiet, began to quietly support Maya's actions. But the divide was palpable. The racist remarks had always existed in whispers, but now they were becoming louder, bolder. And when a group of students started to gather in groups in the cafeteria, exchanging stories about what had happened, Maya felt a sense of unease. The atmosphere at Oakwood had shifted, and she knew it wasn't going to be an easy fight. One afternoon, as Maya sat in the library, she received a message on her phone. It was from Kira. "Come to the cafeteria after school. Something's happening." Maya's heart raced. She had been avoiding the cafeteria for days, not wanting to deal with the tension in the air. But this time, she knew she couldn't avoid it. After the final bell rang, Maya made her way to the cafeteria, her steps hesitant. She walked through the double doors and was immediately met with a strange sight. A group of students had gathered around one of the tables, and in the center of it all was Jamal. He was surrounded by several of the football players, the ones who had never really interacted with him before, not in any meaningful way. They were laughing together, but Maya could see the tension in Jamal's eyes. He looked uncomfortable, as if he didn't belong there, but he was going along with it, not wanting to make waves. Kira, who was standing off to the side, caught Maya's eye and waved her over. Maya walked toward her, confusion clouding her thoughts. "What's going on?" Maya whispered as she joined Kira. Kira smiled, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "This is it, Maya. Jamal's taking a stand too." "What do you mean?" "Look," Kira said, gesturing toward Jamal. "He's done staying quiet." Maya's gaze snapped to Jamal. He was standing tall now, his shoulders relaxed, but his eyes were focused. He was talking to the football players, Brian, Tyler, and a few others. And though he was laughing along with them, there was a palpable shift. It wasn't just about basketball anymore. He was talking about something bigger. He was talking about his place at Oakwood, about how he had been treated for years, about how the whole system was built to keep people like him on the outside. "What's he saying?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's saying he's tired of being quiet, tired of letting it slide. And you know what? They're listening." Maya watched as Jamal took the floor, his voice steady and confident as he addressed the group. The others were silent now. Their laughter subsided, their eyes fixed on him. "You guys don't get it," Jamal was saying, his voice carrying across the room. "I'm not just some player on the team. I'm not just here for your entertainment. I'm a person, just like everyone else. I've had to work 10 times harder than any of you just to get noticed. And every time I step on that court, there's someone whispering about me, judging me before I even open my mouth. It's not just about the game anymore." Maya's heart swelled with pride. This was the Jamal she knew, the one who had always been strong but kept his true thoughts to himself. Now he was putting it all out there, confronting the racism that had always simmered beneath the surface. One of the football players, Brian, shifted uncomfortably before speaking up. "Look, man, I didn't mean to—" "No, you didn't mean to," Jamal interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "But that's the problem. You didn't mean to, but you still did it. And nobody calls you out on it because it's just a joke or it's no big deal. But it is a big deal. It always has been." There was a long silence, and Maya could see the conflict on the faces of the students gathered around Jamal. Some were nodding, while others were still hesitant, unsure of how to react. Maya noticed that the divide between the white students and the students of color in the room was growing more apparent. The uncomfortable silence stretched on, and Maya felt her heart racing. Finally, Sarah Green, the girl who had mocked Jamal in gym class, spoke up. Her voice was laced with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. "Okay, I get it. You're saying that we've all been racist or whatever. But that's not what we're trying to do. We're not all like that." Jamal's expression hardened. "It's not about what you intend to do, Sarah. It's about what's been happening for years. It's about how every time someone like me steps up, they get pushed down. I'm not asking for you to feel bad. I'm asking for you to recognize that there's a problem. And that problem isn't just in the jokes we tell. It's in the way we treat each other." The room was heavy with tension, and Maya felt as though the entire cafeteria was holding its breath. It was the moment of truth. The question was no longer whether Jamal was going to speak out. It was whether anyone else was going to step forward. After a few long moments, Tyler, another football player, spoke up. "You're right, man. We've all been part of this. I never thought about it like that." Maya's heart skipped a beat. For the first time, she saw the shift. It wasn't just Jamal standing up. It was others, too. The students who had once stayed silent, unsure of where they stood, were now beginning to question their own actions. The aftermath of Jamal's confrontation in the cafeteria was unlike anything Maya had expected. The ripple effect spread through the school like a shockwave, causing both division and awakening. Jamal's decision to stand up had forced people to confront the racism that had quietly seeped into Oakwood's halls. The whispers that had once been hushed were now spoken openly. Conversations that had once avoided uncomfortable truths were now demanding attention. It wasn't just the students who were talking. The teachers began to notice too. Some, like Mrs. Sullivan, the history teacher, expressed quiet support. Others, like Mr. Carpenter, the gym teacher, seemed confused, unsure of how to address the situation. But no one could ignore the tension that had begun to fill every classroom, every hallway. Maya could feel the weight of it everywhere she went. During lunch, when she sat with Kira, she couldn't help but notice how the cafeteria was divided. Again, the black students, the Hispanic students, and the few Asian students sat together, while the white students formed their own groups. There was no longer any pretense of unity, just a stark separation of us versus them. And yet, amidst all of this, there was a new energy in the air, a hope that things could change. Jamal was different now. He had always been a quiet, stoic figure, but now there was something almost empowering about him. He walked through the halls with his head held higher, his posture stronger. It wasn't that he was trying to stand out. It was that he finally felt like he could be seen for who he truly was, rather than just the stereotypes others had placed on him. Yet, despite the growing support from some of his peers, there were still those who resisted the change. Sarah Green, for one, wasn't about to let Jamal's words go unnoticed. She still had her own circle of friends, many of whom had sided with her during the confrontation. She continued to make snide remarks about Jamal whenever they crossed paths, even though she'd tried to make it seem like nothing was wrong. But it wasn't just Sarah anymore. There was a palpable unease among some of the white students, especially those who had never questioned the status quo. For many of them, this situation felt foreign, uncomfortable. They had never been forced to think about their privilege, to think about the way their actions affected others. Maya spent that entire week trying to navigate the new dynamics, torn between wanting to support Jamal and not wanting to add fuel to the fire. She was walking a fine line, knowing that the wrong word, the wrong gesture, could make things worse. And yet, she felt compelled to keep going, to keep pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. It wasn't until Friday afternoon that the tension reached its peak. Maya had just finished a chemistry lab when she received a text from Kira. It was simple. Meet me in the parking lot after school. It's happening. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly what Kira meant. Something was about to change again. She wasn't sure if it was going to be for better or worse, but she had no choice but to follow through. After the final bell rang, Maya made her way to the parking lot. The air was cool, the sky a pale grey, and as she stepped outside, she saw Kira standing by the steps, her arms crossed, her face serious. "What's going on?" Maya asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. Kira looked over her shoulder, checking to see if anyone was watching. "You've seen what's been happening all week, right? The tension, the rumours, the division. Well, it's about to come to a head." Maya frowned, looking around. "What do you mean?" "You're not the only one who's upset. There are other students who've been silent for too long. They want to do something about it." Maya's eyes widened. "Do what? What are you talking about?" "You'll see." At that moment, a few of Jamal's friends appeared in the distance. Tyler, Brian, and a few others. They were walking toward her and Kira, their faces set with determination. Maya noticed a few of the black students from Jamal's circle approaching as well, their expressions just as serious. "We're not going to sit here and let this continue." Jamal's voice suddenly rang out. He had appeared from behind the corner, his face calm but resolute. "I've been thinking about it all week. Maya, Kira, we're organising a protest." The word sent a shiver down Maya's spine. "A protest?" she repeated. "Yeah," Jamal said, his gaze unwavering. "We're going to let everyone know that this isn't okay anymore. We can't keep pretending that the racism here is just a joke. We need to do something about it." Maya was stunned. She hadn't expected this. "But a protest? That's huge. That'll make it all even worse." "No," Kira interjected, her voice filled with quiet strength. "That's the point. It's time for the truth to come out. It's time for Oakwood to face what's been happening for years." Maya hesitated. She understood Jamal's frustration, and she knew that something had to change. But this felt like a tipping point. A protest could either unify everyone or tear the school apart even more. "I don't know if this is a good idea," Maya said, her voice shaky. "What if it gets out of hand? What if it turns into a bigger mess?" Jamal looked at her, his eyes softening. "Maya, we've been quiet for too long, and it hasn't changed anything. We've been polite. We've been patient, but nothing's happened. This is the only way to make sure we're heard." The decision hung in the air, thick with uncertainty. Maya knew that she had to make a choice, but she wasn't sure which side she was on yet. "Let's do it," Kira said firmly. "We're not backing down anymore." The days leading up to the protest felt like a quiet storm, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Maya found herself caught between fear and hope. The fear of what might happen, whether the protest would spiral out of control, whether things would get worse before they got better, and the hope that this moment, this stand, could actually spark the change Oakwood High so desperately needed. The word spread quickly. Word of Jamal's decision to organise the protest reached almost every corner of the school by the end of the week. Some students were on board immediately, eager to take a stand against the racism that had always lurked beneath the surface. Others, like Sarah Green, tried to dismiss it, scoffing at the idea of a protest and claiming that everything was just fine as it was. But the divide was clear, and as the days passed, the tension grew thicker. Maya couldn't stop thinking about the protest. Her conversations with Kira had become more serious, more urgent. They talked late into the night, strategizing how to make the protest effective. It wasn't just about standing outside with signs or chanting slogans. It was about making a real statement. A statement that would force the administration, the teachers and the students to confront the issues that had been ignored for too long. "We can't just go in there, make noise and leave," Kira said one night as they sat in Maya's room. "We need to make sure that our message is clear. We want change, not just some empty gesture." Maya nodded, her mind racing. "But what if we're not ready? What if it doesn't work?" "It will work," Kira insisted. "This is the time. People are listening. Jamal's already gotten their attention, and now it's up to us to show them that we mean it." Maya felt a surge of energy at Kira's words. She knew her friend was right. This was their moment to make a difference. But as the day of the protest approached, a sense of dread lingered in the pit of her stomach. The fear of what might happen, the uncertainty about whether this was truly the right thing to do, crept into her thoughts. What if it backfired? What if the teachers, the administrators, or even the students fought back in a way that they hadn't anticipated? The night before the protest, Maya couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, her mind racing. She thought about Jamal, about the quiet strength he had shown over the years, about the way he had always been forced to endure the slights and the racism without ever speaking up. But now he had finally found his voice, and he was asking others to do the same. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, Maya knew that she couldn't back down. She had to stand with him, with Kira, and with all the other students who had been quietly suffering for so long. The next morning, the school day began like any other, but there was a palpable change in the air. It was as if everyone knew that something was going to happen. The halls were filled with hushed whispers, with students exchanging glances, wondering who would show up to the protest and what kind of impact it would have. At lunch, Maya met Kira and Jamal outside the cafeteria, where they gathered with other students who had decided to join the protest. There was an air of anticipation, but also a sense of nervousness. The group was small, only about 20 students, but the number didn't matter. What mattered was that they had made a stand, and they were ready to make their voices heard. "This is it," Jamal said, his voice low, but filled with resolve. "We're not backing down." Maya could see the determination in his eyes, and it gave her strength. She had feared the consequences, but now, standing with him, standing with the others, she realized how much this moment meant. They were no longer silent. They were no longer invisible. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, the group made their way toward the front steps of the school. Students gathered around, some looking on curiously, others trying to hide their apprehension. Maya felt the eyes on her, some supportive, others judgmental. But she didn't look away. She couldn't. The group stood on the steps, some holding signs that read, "End the silence," and "Racism isn't a joke." The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation, but Maya also noticed the tension that hung in the air. This wasn't just a protest. It was a challenge to the system that had allowed racism to fester for so long. It wasn't long before the administrators arrived. Principal Thompson, a tall, imposing figure with a stern face, stepped forward, flanked by two of the school's security officers. His eyes swept over the crowd, lingering on Jamal, who stood at the forefront, his shoulders squared. "I'm giving you one chance to disperse," Principal Thompson said, his voice firm. "This is an unauthorized protest. If you don't leave now, I will be forced to take disciplinary action." Jamal didn't flinch. He stepped forward, meeting the principal's gaze with unwavering determination. "We're not going anywhere. This isn't just a protest. This is a demand for change. We're tired of being ignored, tired of being silent. You can't make us leave." Maya's heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment. The administration would either listen or they would try to silence them. But either way, they were making a statement. Principal Thompson hesitated, his gaze flicking between Jamal and the growing crowd. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "No," Jamal said, his voice rising with conviction. "The mistake was made when no one listened. The mistake was made when this school let racism slide for years. We're done being quiet." The protest had begun. The schoolyard was silent, except for the murmurs of students gathered in clusters around the protest group. Maya stood next to Jamal, feeling the weight of every gaze upon them. The tension was almost unbearable, thick in the air, as students exchanged nervous glances. She could hear the hum of whispers, but no one dared speak louder than a murmur. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Principal Thompson stood firm, his arms crossed, flanked by the two security guards who stood like silent sentinels, their eyes darting between the protesters and the students watching from the sidelines. Maya could see that the principal wasn't sure how to respond. He had expected the protest to fizzle out before it even started, but now, with Jamal standing his ground, the dynamic had shifted. There was no going back. "You don't have the authority to do this, Jamal," Principal Thompson said, His voice clipped. This protest is unauthorized, and you're disrupting the school environment. Jamal met his gaze unwaveringly, his voice calm but firm. You know what's disruptive, Mr. Thompson? The fact that racism has been ignored in this school for years. The fact that we, as students of colour, have been silenced for so long. That's disruptive. That's the real issue here. Maya's chest tightened as she listened. Jamal had always been reserved, quiet, even humble. But right now, he was a force of nature. His words cut through the air like a blade, and she realized that this wasn't just about Oakwood High. This was about every institution, every person who had let the problem slide for too long. One of the security guards stepped forward, his hand raised as though preparing to issue a warning. Maya's heart skipped a beat, but Jamal didn't back down. "We're not going anywhere," Jamal said, his voice stronger than ever. "This is our right to speak out. We've been silent for far too long. And if you don't want to listen, that's on you." The principal's face flushed with frustration, and Maya could see the shift in his posture. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by students, and certainly not by students who were demanding justice. He looked around at the gathered students, his eyes flicking from one face to the next, trying to gauge the mood. For the first time, it seemed like he was uncertain. "This is not the way to handle things," Principal Thompson said, his voice edging closer to anger. "You're creating division. This is just going to cause chaos." "No," Jamal replied sharply. "You're the one creating division. You and everyone else who lets this slide. If you think racism is a small issue, you're wrong. We're here to show you that it's a big deal." Maya watched as Principal Thompson looked at the group of students gathered around them. The air was thick with anticipation, and for the first time, it felt like everyone was on the edge of something important. It wasn't just Jamal taking a stand anymore. It was all of them, together. The students who had silently endured for so long, who had been too afraid to speak out, were now finding their voices. A voice suddenly cut through the tension. "He's right," came a familiar voice. Maya turned to see Kira stepping forward, her face set with determination. "This isn't about division. This is about standing up for what's right. It's about acknowledging that there's a problem that's been ignored for too long." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then Kira's words seemed to hit like a spark. Students who had been watching from the sidelines began to nod in agreement. Maya could see the shift in their expressions. What had once been uncertainty was now becoming solidarity. The message was clear. They were with Jamal. They were with Kira. They were with each other. Another student, a junior named Andre, stepped forward. He had always been quiet, staying out of the way, but now he spoke up, his voice clear and strong. "We don't want chaos," he said, "but we can't stay silent anymore. We can't let this go on." Maya felt a swell of pride. There was a spark now, something that couldn't be extinguished. The protest had become more than just a demand for recognition. It was a movement, and it was gaining momentum. Principal Thompson's face twisted in frustration as he looked back at his security guards. One of them, a large man with a buzz cut, started to step forward, but Jamal raised his hand. "No," Jamal said, his voice quiet but forceful. "If you want us to leave, you're going to have to make us. But we won't go quietly. Not this time." The standoff was long, tense, and for a moment it seemed like the entire school had frozen in place. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as though the very air was holding its breath. But then something unexpected happened. A few students who had been standing in the back, hesitant to get involved, began to step forward, slowly at first, then with more confidence. And then, suddenly, more students began to join them. Some of the students who had been on the other side, who had once been dismissive of the protest, now seemed to reconsider their stance. They could see the unity, the resolve in the students who had come together. Sarah Green was among them. Maya didn't know what to expect, but she watched as Sarah approached the group, her steps slow and uncertain. For a moment, it seemed as though she might speak out against them, but instead, she simply stood next to Jamal, her eyes fixed on Principal Thompson. The others followed her lead, standing together as a sign of unity. No one moved to disperse the protest. The silence that followed was almost deafening. And then, the first teacher, Mrs. Sullivan, stepped outside. She wasn't alone. Several other teachers, including Mr. Harris, the history teacher who had always been known for his progressive views, stood with her. Mrs. Sullivan, who had been a quiet ally of the students, nodded at Jamal and the others. "We're with you," she said softly. "We won't let this go unnoticed anymore." And in that moment, everything shifted. The resistance from the administration was still there. But the teachers, the very people who had the power to change things, had made their stance clear. The students weren't alone anymore. The protest, which had started as a quiet stand against an unspoken problem, had now become something bigger. It was no longer just about Oakwood High. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. It was a movement that was starting to gain traction, one voice at a time. As the protest continued, Maya realized something. It wasn't just the protest itself that mattered. It was the fact that they had all come together. They had stood up, despite their fear, despite the uncertainty. They had shown that when people are pushed to their breaking point, they find strength they never knew they had. And for the first time in a long time, Maya believed that things could change. The protest continued to unfold before Maya's eyes. What had started as a small gathering of students determined to make their voices heard had now become something larger, something that no one, least of all Principal Thompson, had expected. As the protesters stood firm on the front steps, a group of teachers who had gathered by the sidelines were now speaking to the students, quietly offering their support. The presence of teachers like Mrs. Sullivan and Mr. Harris was a crucial turning point. They weren't just passive observers, they were now participants in the movement. They weren't content to let their students fight for change on their own. They understood that this wasn't just a teenage rebellion. This was a fight for justice, for equality, and for the simple recognition of human dignity. "You're not alone," Mrs. Sullivan said, her voice calm but resolute. "This fight is bigger than Oakwood High. It's bigger than you or me, but change starts with people like you." Maya's heart swelled with emotion. She had always admired Mrs. Sullivan, but now, seeing her stand up for what was right, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride. For the first time in her life, Maya realized that even small acts of support could ripple out and create real change. The tension between the students and the administration was palpable, but now it seemed to be reaching a boiling point. Principal Thompson, who had once been the pillar of authority at Oakwood, now seemed uncertain. He had been trying to regain control, but as more students joined the protest and the teachers spoke out, it became increasingly clear that this was no longer something that could be dismissed or ignored. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd on the steps grew. Students who had initially stood on the sidelines now took their places in the protest, their resolve growing stronger with each passing minute. Even some of the students who had once been on the opposite side of the issue now found themselves questioning their previous positions. This wasn't just about race anymore. It was about basic human decency. It was about recognizing that, For too long, people had been allowed to suffer in silence. Kira stood beside Maya, her eyes scanning the crowd. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not turning back now. We've made our statement." Maya nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe how much had happened in such a short time. It felt like the school was on the brink of something transformative, but the fear of what would happen next still hung over them like a storm cloud. "I never thought it would come to this," Maya admitted. "I never thought we'd actually make it this far." "Of course we would," Kira said with a grin. "You always underestimate yourself, Maya. You've been fighting this battle your whole life. It's just that now you've got the strength to see it through." Maya felt a smile tug at the corner of her lips. Kira was right. For too long, Maya had kept her head down, avoiding the conflicts around her, content to be a silent witness. But now, thanks to Jamal and Kira, she had found her voice. She had found the courage to stand up, to be a part of something bigger than herself. The group of students stood together, some holding signs, some simply standing with their arms crossed, their faces set with determination. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation. It was as if the entire school was waiting for the tipping point, and Maya could feel it too. The moment that had started as a quiet protest against the racism in Oakwood High was now evolving into a movement, one that was about to change the way they all saw each other. But there was still a part of Maya that feared what would happen if things went too far. Would the administration buckle under the pressure? Or would they dig in their heels, refusing to acknowledge the problem that had been ignored for so long? Would the protest succeed in its mission? Or would it be crushed by the weight of the school's established power dynamics? Suddenly, there was a shift in the crowd. Maya turned her attention to the front of the school, where a group of students had gathered to listen. Jamal had stepped forward again, his expression intense, his eyes focused as he spoke to the growing crowd. "This isn't just about Oakwood," Jamal's voice echoed, his words carrying on the wind. "This is about every school, every institution, where racism still exists. This is about every student of color who's ever been ignored, who's ever been dismissed, who's ever been told they're not good enough. We're not here to ask for permission. We're here to demand change." His words hung in the air like a challenge. The crowd was silent for a moment, absorbing his message. Then, as if on cue, a wave of applause rippled through the students. The tension that had gripped the school just hours before seemed to dissipate, replaced by a collective sense of unity. Maya felt a lump rise in her throat. She had known that Jamal was a leader, but hearing him speak like that, so passionate, so unwavering, was like nothing she had ever witnessed before. In that moment, it wasn't just his fight, it was everyone's fight. Principal Thompson, who had been standing on the sidelines, took a step forward. His face was hard to read, but it was clear that the protest had taken him by surprise. Maya could see the frustration in his eyes as he approached Jamal. "This is not the way to handle things," the principal said, his voice rising in anger. "You're disrupting the entire school. You're putting everyone in a difficult position." Jamal didn't flinch. "You're right, Mr. Thompson," he said. "We're putting the system in a difficult position because the system is broken, and if you're not willing to fix it, we will." The principal's face hardened, and he seemed to take a step back. He knew that there was no way to put the genie back in the bottle. The protest had already sparked something that couldn't be undone. As the protest continued, more students joined, and even some parents who had arrived to pick up their children stood by, watching in silence. The words of Jamal and the other students seemed to resonate, reaching beyond the boundaries of the school. Maya knew, in that moment, that this protest had already become something larger than she had ever imagined. And then, in the midst of the chaos, there was a sudden shout from the back of the crowd. "Everyone, look!" Maya turned quickly and saw a large group of students from a nearby high school had arrived. They were holding signs, joining in the protest. Word had spread, and it was clear that this was no longer just about Oakwood High. It was about a much bigger issue. The ripple effect had begun, and it was gaining momentum. The arrival of students from neighbouring schools was a defining moment in the protest's development. It was as if the spark Jamal had ignited was catching fire, and the heat was quickly spreading beyond the walls of Oakwood High. The sight of more students joining the protest sent a jolt of energy through the crowd. Word had spread faster than anyone had expected, and what had begun as a localized stand against Oakwood's complacency was now a movement. Maya stood at the center of it all, feeling both exhilarated and overwhelmed. She had always been a part of the quiet background, not one to make waves, but now she was surrounded by a sea of voices, all demanding change. The energy in the air was thick with passion, and she could feel the pulse of it in her chest. The students who had arrived from the neighbouring schools were mostly older, high school juniors and seniors who had seen the injustices firsthand. They had heard about Oakwood's protest through social media, and they had come to show solidarity. Some held signs that read "No More Silence" and "Black Lives Matter," while others stood with arms crossed, silently observing the growing crowd. Jamal stood tall at the front, his voice steady and unwavering as he addressed the new arrivals. "Thank you for coming," he said. "What started here today isn't just about Oakwood. It's about a movement that needs to spread everywhere. We can't be quiet any longer." The message was clear. The protest wasn't a one-time event. It was a call to action, a demand for the recognition of voices that had long been silenced. It wasn't just about speaking up against racism. It was about forcing people to look at the systems of inequality that perpetuated the problem in the first place. Maya glanced over at Kira, who was standing beside her, arms crossed, a look of quiet determination on her face. Kira had been right all along. This moment had come because they had refused to stay silent, because they had chosen to speak out, even when the stakes were high. The energy continued to grow as more students gathered. As the crowd swelled, so did the tension. The administration, which had once seemed so confident in its authority, was now struggling to regain control. Principal Thompson had retreated into his office, along with a few other administrators, leaving the students outside in the growing heat, with only a handful of teachers remaining by their side. For the first time in Oakwood's history, a stand was being taken. It was more than just about making noise. It was about making sure that the voices of the marginalized were heard and respected. But despite the support, there was a growing sense of unease in the crowd. Some students had begun to shout in frustration, demanding to be heard. The protest, which had started as a peaceful demonstration, was beginning to teeter on the edge of chaos. Maya could see the division forming in the crowd. Some were ready to push forward with the fight, while others were looking to the teachers for guidance, afraid that the situation was getting out of control. Kira noticed it too. "We need to stay focused," she said, pulling Maya aside. "This protest can't devolve into something more violent. We have to show them that we're here for change, not just for a fight." Maya nodded. Kira was right. The last thing they needed was for the protest to lose its focus. The message had to remain clear, or everything they had fought for would be undermined. Just then, one of the teachers, Mr. Harris, approached the group. He was tall, with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, and he looked every bit the image of a progressive educator. But now there was a level of concern in his eyes. "We need to move this inside," he said, his voice urgent. "The school board is going to be here soon. They're bringing in a few officials to try to defuse this." Jamal stepped forward, his face unreadable. "We're not going inside. We're staying right here, Mr. Harris. We've waited too long to be heard." Mr. Harris hesitated but nodded. "I understand," he said. "But this is bigger than just Oakwood. The administration's already under pressure. They won't be able to ignore it for much longer." Maya felt a surge of pride as she watched Jamal. He was leading them all in a fight they didn't think they could win. And now, it seemed that the school board was going to have to confront the reality of the situation. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the crowd grew increasingly restless. News outlets had started to report on the protest, and even local community leaders had begun to pay attention. It was no longer just a group of students making noise. It was a movement that demanded to be heard, that demanded change. But with the pressure mounting, the situation was becoming more volatile. A small group of students, their faces angry and flushed with frustration, began chanting louder, urging the protest to escalate. Maya could see the energy shifting. What had started as a peaceful demonstration was now on the brink of becoming something else, something that could undo everything they had fought for. "Maya," Kira said, grabbing her by the arm, "we need to calm this down. If we don't, it's all going to fall apart." Maya swallowed hard, glancing at Jamal, who was still standing at the front, his eyes trained on the growing crowd. He was their leader, and it was clear that he understood the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a protest. It was the defining moment of their high school careers. "I know," Maya said, her voice trembling. "But how?" Kira gave her a small, determined smile. "We remind them what this is about. We remind them why we're here." And so with that, Maya took a deep breath, stepping forward alongside Kira. They pushed through the crowd, slowly but surely, until they were standing in front of the group of students who were calling for more radical action. Maya raised her hand, calling for silence. "We're here for change," Maya said, her voice clear and strong. "But if we lose control, we'll lose everything we've worked for. This is about making sure our voices are heard, not about making more enemies. We have to stay focused." The words seemed to settle over the group like a wave. The chanting began to slow, and slowly, one by one, the students stopped, turning their attention to Maya and Kira. It wasn't easy, but the momentum was shifting again. They were at a crossroads, and Maya knew they couldn't afford to lose sight of why they had started this in the first place. "Stay with us," Jamal said from the front, his voice commanding. "We've come this far together. We need to stay united." And just like that, the energy of the protest shifted again. The students, their faces flushed but determined, stood in unity, their resolve harder than ever. The administrators, now clearly nervous, stood at a distance, watching the protest unfold. It was no longer just a matter of whether the students would make their voices heard. It was a matter of how much change they could bring about. As the protest continued, Maya realized something. This wasn't just about Oakwood High. This was about every school, every institution that had allowed racism to persist unchecked. And in that moment, she knew they had already won. The system couldn't ignore them any longer. The protest had taken on a life of its own. What began as a quiet stand against the injustices that Jamal and others had experienced for years was now an all-encompassing movement that had not only taken over Oakwood High, but had also captured the attention of the surrounding community. With news outlets picking up the story and social media flooded with updates and support from students and alumni alike, the protest was growing exponentially in both scope and intensity. For the students of Oakwood High, the days leading up to the protest had been filled with uncertainty and fear. Would they be dismissed as troublemakers? Would their demands fall on deaf ears? But as they stood together in the school courtyard, the numbers swelling around them, it became clear that this wasn't just a small group of students voicing their frustration. It was the beginning of a significant moment in their lives. And for Maya, who had spent so much of her life in the background, silently observing the world around her, this moment was transformative. She had gone from a passive bystander to someone actively shaping the narrative, someone whose voice had power. The day after the protest had escalated, it was clear that Oakwood High had reached a turning point. The administration, led by Principal Thompson, had scrambled to regain control, but it was too late. The protest had shifted from a school issue to a larger conversation about systemic racism. The school district was now under pressure from not only students but also parents, community leaders and outside organizations demanding that Oakwood High address the ongoing issues of discrimination and inequality. Principal Thompson had promised a meeting with the students who had led the protest, including Jamal, Maya and Kira. The promise of dialogue had been made in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. But as Maya and the others prepared for the meeting, they couldn't help but feel that it was too little, too late. The damage had already been done. Too much had been exposed. And the question now was whether the administration would truly listen or just offer empty promises. The meeting took place in the school's conference room, a sterile space lined with white walls and the faint smell of old coffee. Jamal, Kira, Maya, and a few of their allies filed in, each one feeling the weight of what they were about to undertake. As they sat down at the long table, facing Principal Thompson and a handful of school board members, Maya could feel the intensity of the situation settling in. It was more than just a meeting. It was a battle for the future of Oakwood High, for the future of every student who had been silenced. Principal Thompson, who had been visibly shaken by the events of the past days, cleared his throat as he addressed the group. "I want to start by acknowledging the events that took place last week," he said, his tone firm but lacking the usual confidence he carried. "What happened was unprecedented, and I want to make it clear that the administration takes these concerns seriously. We are committed to addressing the issues of racism that have come to light." Maya exchanged a glance with Jamal and Kira. They had heard these kinds of promises before, empty words spoken to quell anger, to silence dissent. But now things were different. The students who had been part of the protest were no longer willing to accept vague reassurances. They had seen the cracks in the system, and they weren't going to let it go unnoticed. "We've heard a lot of empty words already, Mr. Thompson," Jamal said, his voice steady, but with a hint of defiance. "It's not enough to just acknowledge the problem. We need action. We need real change. We need to know that you're going to make a concrete commitment to ending the racism that's been allowed to persist in this school." The room fell silent. Jamal's words hung in the air, and for the first time since the protest had started, Principal Thompson seemed unsure of himself. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but Maya could see that he was genuinely listening. The shift wasn't immediate, but it was there. There was no denying that the protest had shaken the school to its core. One of the school board members, a woman named Mrs. Adams, spoke up. "We understand the gravity of the situation," she said, her voice smooth but cautious. "But we need to approach this in a way that doesn't disrupt the entire educational experience for the students. We need a solution that works for everyone, not just a select few." Maya clenched her fists, fighting the urge to speak out. It was always the same line, wasn't it? "We need a solution that works for everyone." As though addressing racism was something that could be negotiated, like scheduling a class or arranging a school event. There was no middle ground here. Racism was not something that could be fixed without addressing the root causes, without real commitment. "We don't need a solution," Maya said, finally finding her voice. "We need accountability. We need transparency. We need to know that the school board isn't going to just sweep this under the rug like they have in the past. Her words struck a chord in the room. Kira leaned forward, her eyes sharp as she added, "We're not asking for sympathy. We're asking for justice, for change, for equity. This isn't just about Oakwood. It's about the systems that allow racism to thrive everywhere." The tension in the room escalated. Principal Thompson looked at the school board members, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Mrs. Adams, who had initially seemed to hold a degree of power in the discussion, now looked conflicted. But even as the board members whispered among themselves, it became clear that the conversation had taken a turn. The students had successfully moved the conversation from acknowledgement to accountability, and that was a monumental shift. After a long pause, Principal Thompson spoke again, this time with a reluctant edge to his voice. "We will be forming a task force to address these issues, one that includes students, teachers, and members of the community. We will be holding workshops to educate both faculty and students on racism, systemic inequality, and how we can improve the overall climate at Oakwood." Maya wasn't sure if the words were genuine or just a calculated attempt to quell the unrest, but at that moment it didn't matter. The commitment to form a task force was a significant step. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the meeting came to an end, Jamal, Kira, and Maya stood up, their heads held high. They hadn't won the war yet, but they had taken a crucial step toward it. The task force was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but now, for the first time, they had been given a seat at the table. When the door to the conference room closed behind them, the weight of what they had just achieved settled in. They had made their voices heard, and no one would be able to ignore them anymore. The aftermath of the meeting with Principal Thompson and the school board was a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Jamal, Maya, and Kira felt a strange sense of accomplishment. Although the victory was not yet complete, they had succeeded in pushing the administration to take the first steps toward addressing the issue of racism at Oakwood High. The announcement of the task force was a small but significant victory, but the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. Over the following days, the atmosphere at Oakwood High continued to shift. The once unspoken racial tension was now being discussed openly in the classrooms, the hallways, and the lunchroom. Teachers were being asked to participate in workshops that addressed racism and systemic inequality. And students, particularly those who had remained silent for so long, were beginning to ask hard questions. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and everyone, whether they were ready or not, was being forced to confront the issues that had plagued the school for years. For Maya, the change was both invigorating and overwhelming. She found herself grappling with the weight of the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. She had never intended to become a leader. She had never expected to be the one pushing for change. But now she was an integral part of this movement, and it was a role she had to step into, whether she was ready or not. The weeks that followed the protest were a blur of meetings, discussions, and debates. The task force, which included students, teachers, and parents, began working to identify concrete actions that could be taken to address the systemic issues at Oakwood. The task force's mandate was to develop a comprehensive plan that would ensure racism and discrimination were no longer tolerated at the school. This included revising the school's policies on diversity and inclusion, implementing mandatory anti-racism education for both students and faculty, and creating a system for reporting and addressing incidents of discrimination. But while there was progress, there were still many obstacles to overcome. Not all the teachers were on board with the new initiatives. Some openly resented the changes, seeing them as unnecessary or even as an infringement on their authority. The school board, too, was cautious. They had made the right noises about addressing racism, But when it came to actual policy changes, they were hesitant to take any drastic steps that might alienate the community or disrupt the status quo. Maya saw this firsthand when she attended the first task force meeting. Despite the support of some teachers and community leaders, there were others who seemed more concerned with protecting their own positions than with creating real change. One teacher, Mr. Crawford, a history instructor who had always been a favourite among the students, spoke up during the meeting. "I understand that there are issues we need to address," Mr. Crawford said, adjusting his glasses. "But let's not go too far. I don't think the entire curriculum needs to be overhauled just because of one protest. We have to be careful not to let this become some kind of witch hunt." Maya clenched her jaw, feeling her temper rise. This was the kind of complacency that had allowed racism to flourish in Oakwood for so long. The kind of attitude that treated racism as a peripheral issue, something that could be swept aside in favor of maintaining the status quo. "You don't understand," Maya said, standing up from her seat. "Racism isn't something that can just be talked about in passing. It's not something that's just going to go away with a few workshops. It's ingrained in the system, and we need to confront it head on if we're ever going to change anything." Mr. Crawford looked taken aback, and several others in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances. Maya could feel the weight of their judgment, but she refused to back down. The time for appeasing people's discomfort was over. They had to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. "We can't just go through the motions here," Maya continued, her voice firm. "This has to be real. It has to be permanent. If we're not committed to making real change, then all of this is just a waste of time." Jamal, who had been quiet up until this point, nodded in agreement. "Maya's right. If we don't address the root causes of racism, nothing's going to change. The workshops are a start, but they're just the beginning. We need to do more." The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Mrs. Adams, the school board member who had been part of the original meeting with the students, spoke up. "I think what Maya and Jamal are saying is important," she said. "But we also need to be mindful of the broader community. We can't alienate everyone with sweeping changes. It's about balance." Maya felt the familiar frustration building inside her. "Balance? What about the balance of power?" she asked. "What about the balance of who gets to have their voice heard and who gets ignored?" Mrs. Adams fell silent at this, and for a moment Maya thought she might have made a breakthrough. But the hesitation in the room was palpable. It was clear that there were many who were still uncomfortable with the idea of truly confronting the problem. The task force meeting continued, but it felt like a slow, grinding process. Everyone was talking, but very little was actually being done. Outside of the task force meetings, the atmosphere at Oakwood High remained tense. There were still pockets of resistance among the student body, and the divide between those who supported the protest and those who felt it had gone too far seemed to be growing. Sarah Green and her group of friends had been vocal in their opposition, dismissing the protest as overblown and claiming that the students were just looking for trouble. Maya overheard one of Sarah's conversations in the hallway one day. "It's like they want to make everything about race," Sarah said, her voice loud enough for Maya to hear. "I mean, we're all in the same school, right? What's the big deal?" Maya didn't respond immediately, but she felt a pang of anger in her chest. She knew Sarah didn't understand. She didn't understand what it felt like to walk through the halls and feel like you didn't belong, to have your existence constantly questioned by people who didn't even see you as fully human. Sarah was right about one thing. The protest wasn't just about race. It was about belonging. It was about being seen. It was about fighting for the right to exist without fear, without judgment. That evening, Maya sat in her room, staring out the window, her thoughts swirling. It felt like they were pushing against a wall that refused to budge. They had made progress, but there was so much more work to do. The task force would meet again next week, but Maya wasn't sure if the changes they were pushing for would ever come to fruition. The school was a deeply entrenched system, and it was hard to know whether their efforts would be enough to change it. But as she sat there, her mind racing, one thought kept coming back to her. They couldn't stop now. No matter how difficult the road ahead seemed, they had come too far to turn back. They had made their voices heard, and they weren't going to let anyone drown them out again.